Λοιπόν, σας καλησπερίζω σήμερα. Έχουμε κοντά μας τον Clarence Barlow, ο οποίος είναι από τους πρωτοπόρους της computer music. Δηλαδή, ξεκίνησε ήδη από τη δεκαετία του 70 να προγραμματίζει σε υπολογιστή τη μουσική. Και δουλεύει κατά κύριο λόγο αυτό που λέμε αλγοριθμική μουσική. Δηλαδή παράγει τη μουσική, δεν παράγει τόσο τον ήχο, όσο παράγει τη μουσική αυτή καθ' αυτή μέσα από τα συστήματα που αναπτύσσει. Ήταν ο δάσκαλός μου στην κολονία, το 1983, όταν πήγα, και είχα τύχει να τον έχω, γιατί ήταν η πρώτη τάξη computer music στον κόσμο, δεν υπήρχε. Αλλά επειδή ήταν τρελός αυτός, του ζήτησε εκεί πέρα και κάνανε μια τάξη computer music. Αργότερα ακολούθησαν πολλές, αλλά και κάτσαμε μαζί 3-4 χρόνια, 5. Η δουλειά του έχει πάρα πολύ ενδιαφέρον και μπορείτε να βρείτε μερικά στο YouTube. Σήμερα θα μας παρουσιάσει ένα νεότερο κομμάτι που τον προβληματίζει, που είναι ακριβώς η μεταφορά της εικόνας σε ήχο και του ήχου στη μουσική. Μετά την ομιλία θα υπάρχει και χρόνος για ερωτήσεις. Ευχαριστώ.
Well, thank you for coming. This subject, sonification of image and visualization of sound, is something which has always been very close to me. Already in the 1970s, I had some ideas. So I will start at once and go into it. This was a composition of mine from 1972. It was an electronic piece, and here are two tracks. One is red, one is blue, and the vertical axis is pitch, the horizontal axis is time, and the thickness of the lines shows the amplitude. So here you have in track 5 a loud sound which gradually gets softer, and then it is interrupted, and then it carries on, and then it becomes inaudible. So in the red field you can see all the pitches are fixed. They do not move. But in the blue field, the amplitudes don't change. Over there, all the tones move up and down, but the amplitudes do not change. So at the very beginning, if you look at this drawing here, and this goes over the range of the piece from about 17 hertz to about 17,000 hertz, you will see that the only tone you can expect to hear is this one. And also the blue one at the same pitch. This one will be masked by the lower one, so it will not be audible either. So out of the hundreds of tones that are technically possible, you will actually only hear one. But why do I have this graph? I didn't need it. I made the piece entirely by programming in Fortran in Cologne University. Then I took the program to Stockholm, to the IEMA studio, and realized the piece, and I never needed a graph. But I was curious. I wanted to make a visualization of this piece so that I could see it move with my eyes as well as my ears. So I have about 40 seconds. The piece is 24 minutes long, and it's 8 tracks. Here are 5 and 6 out of 8. And I'll play you the first 40 seconds of these two. So at the beginning you'll hear just this sound, and then gradually these sounds will begin to come in. Occasionally you'll hear high sounds over there, and very low ones as well. Technically, this piece is infinite in frequency range. It can go from 0 hertz to infinity. And technically, it's infinite in duration. And I only have 24 minutes of it recorded. But one day I would like still to make a real-time installation where you go in and go 3 years later and hear how it has carried on. But whether that will happen or not, I don't know. But here we go. Sorry, I just wanted to do this. Didn't know it would stop. It's here. This one. So it's a very short example, but you get the idea to be able to see it and as well as hear it. Another piece of mine written in 1976 for 2 pianos. Let me go on to show you the actual graph, and then I'll get back to 1976. This I programmed in Linux in 2001. You must imagine this piece to be for 2 pianos with 30 pulses horizontally, always moving from left to right. So it's like a text. Here are the first 30 pulses, then the next 30 pulses, then the next 30, and this is one section. This is another section, this is another section. These musics are atonical, ametrical, tonical, metrical. I'll explain that when I come back to it. What I wanted to do was to choose colors for the different tones. And so going back, you will see that for the circle of fifths, I chose green for the G, red for the B, and blue for the E flat, and went through the color circle. For louder sounds, I made it darker by adding some black. For softer sounds, I added white. Now, here was the plan. The 2 pianos would be represented by 2 squares, one inside the other. The biggest square was piano 1, the smaller square was piano 2. And you would then see how the music would move. The only trouble is, in those days in 1976, we didn't have any color printing, except expensive, very expensive. So I thought that I would buy stickers and paint them by hand, and then stick them by hand. And this piece contains a total of about 70,000 notes. And I realized that I'd have to work for several hours every day, and probably inaccurately, to do the whole thing. So I just gave it up. But then when I was able to program in Linux in color on the Atari, that wasn't possible. I used the Atari from 84 to the present day. I still use it. But I started to use the PC in Linux in 2001. Actually, Costas was of great help in me getting to understand the Atari, because I bought it for the school where he was a student. But he knew more about it than I did. And he showed me how to use the Atari. And I still use it even today, and I'm quite an expert. But this I programmed in Linux. And so you can see in this first section, it's atonical, ametrical, reflected in the color choice. You see, since there are so many different colors, you can see the colors are chosen from all over the circle of fifths. And you can see the rhythms are also, the various dark images are on accents, and these are all over the place. It looks a bit like Hundertwasser. Anybody who knows his work might recognize that. And this is atonal or atonical ametrical music. You could hear a low B flat as a drone coming in twice. That's at the beginning of every cycle, there's this B flat, the low note, played by one piano, played by the other piano. Now here, you will see a similarly chaotic looking geometric shape, but the color is much more similar. So this is because it's tonical. So you can hear it's more in a tonal form. So if I go down here to atonical metrical, now you'll hear a meter of 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and you can see that the first pulse is always attacked, then the third, the second is always silent. Here are some always silent pulses. So you have a kind of vertical shaping, which shows you that this is a very metrical music within the cycle. And this now is tonical and metrical. So again, 2 cycles, the top cycle and the second one. So you can actually see. My publisher, back in the 70s, when I told him my plan, he said, oh, that'll also be very expensive to print. And I agreed. That's why also I didn't do it. But today I don't print it because I think in a lecture like this is sufficient. You don't really need it. But that was something that interested me to visualize the piece and to be able to see, this is atonical, this is ametrical, this is metrical, this is ametrical, and so on. If you have any questions at any time, please don't hesitate. Moving on, this is a piece for piano trio, violin, cello, and piano. I was asked by an ensemble in Cologne to write them a piece, and I thought, well, it's a pretty old medium, and this was 1980 approximately, so would I want to go back to that medium? And one day, sitting in a concert that they played, where they played all kinds of classical music up to the end of the 19th century, I thought, this seems like a challenge to make a historical piece in which I would take their repertoire and make that into a composition of my own. So I worked out this plan. C stands for Clementi, S stands for Schumann, and R stands for Ravel. So I took three composers who are approximately 60 years apart. And the interesting thing was Ravel was 60 years before me. So I was like the fourth composer in the game, always 60 years. And my plan was the position of an instrument, you can see the piano, the violin, and the cello, the position of an instrument would always give you how much percent of that composer's music was being played at that time in that instrument. So for instance, at the beginning they're all in the middle. That means each one of them plays 33% of Schumann, Clementi, and Ravel's music. But there are three spirals. So if we take one position like 17 times 18 gives you the bar number. So the actual bar number divided by 18 is the place number here. So the piano is between Clementi and Schumann. The cello is a little closer to Schumann, and the violin is pretty close to Schumann. But they're all very far. The violin's very far from Clementi and very far from Ravel. So let me give you an example of the beginning where all three are equal. So what's happening with the mic? It's obviously changed. Oh, because of music. So a mixture of all three composers. I'll briefly describe how I did it. I wrote down on 12 staves on manuscript paper, 3 for the violin for the three composers, 3 for the cello for the three composers, and 6 for the piano for the three composers. So I wrote down the scores on manuscript paper. Now with Ravel it was a problem because Ravel was always doing a Celerandi and Decelerandi. So I worked out a mathematical way to fit that exactly into the constant meter that I had chosen for the whole piece. So once I'd written it all out, then I worked out the probabilities for every bar, for every instrument, for every composer. So I had 9 columns of probabilities. And I compare it to, say, having 9 record players, where each instrument is represented on one record, and each composer on one record, so you have 9 records for that reason. And the needles, all that's happening is the needles go up and down, so that you hear a little of that composer, then you don't, then you do, and then you don't. And that goes on according to the probabilities of the whole piece. It took me about 1 month to transcribe the 3 pieces onto the manuscript paper. It took me 1 month to work out the probabilities. And then it took me 1 month to actually write the score. So here's another bit, which is more Ravel and Clementi, less Schumann. Well, it depends. The cello is here, so the piano is here. The piano is closer to Ravel, and the violin is a little closer to Schumann. Well, actually quite a bit. So this is the next. And this place here, you see more Ravel and Clementi and less Schumann. And at this place, all 3, you will notice the spirals are worked out in such a way, and this is the mathematical formula. This is the angle in time. Time is t. And these are the instruments, I, which are 1, 2, 3. And omega gives you the angle, and x and y, the Cartesian coordinates based on time and omega. So at any given point, you know where the instruments are going to be, and the probability depends on that. So at the end, they all pass through Clementi. They actually join together and are all together in Clementi, and then they move out. So lots of Clementi there, with little bits of Ravel and Schumann thrown in, because they are not infinitely distant. So a few notes here and there from Ravel and Schumann come in. Okay? Mm-hmm. So now, this graph I made years after composing the piece, because I wanted to do it for a lecture on the piece. So again, I visualized the piece in the form of this graph. Here's a piece called Im Januar am Nil, in January at the Nile, which works a lot on phonetics and on a Schenker synthesis, the opposite of Schenker analysis, a kind of melody which gets longer and longer and longer, and as time goes on, more and more notes come into it. So you can see here, this is where the piece starts. This is the first spiral arm, I call it generation, and the first note of the piece comes in here. Then you have a second spiral arm, and in this spiral arm there are 4 notes. So the principle of the melody is, for every spiral arm or generation, there are 24 n pulses. So in the first there'll be 24 pulses, in the second will be 48, 72, 96, and so on. But the number of attacks is n squared. So there is 1 attack in the first generation, 4 in the second, 9 in the third, 16 in the fourth. So in the 24th generation, there are 576 pulses and 576 attacks. So you can see it's totally saturated at the end. And every note is carried on to the next generation. It's inherited. And then sometimes it splits into 2, a leading note and the note itself. Later on, I will not go into detail, I actually replace the note by a close relative. So if I have a D, later on in the piece, it might become an A, something like that. But basically, again here, I wanted to make a film to demonstrate this piece. So in this particular film, this ball moves along the spiral arms, just around and round and round. These are extra disturbing aspects where the woodwinds, the percussion, and the strings make chords. So if you imagine this ball moving from left to right, gradually going down, at some point it'll touch a dot. And there, the woodwinds will make a noise, which is against the principle of the piece. Percussion, same thing, but working horizontally. And here strings, again, vertically, just for reasons of space. I put them in like this. And another thing is that the actual orchestration for the strings is based on speech. I developed a technique which I call synthrumentation, which means I analyze speech with Fourier analysis, in other words, spectral analysis of speech, and then I orchestrate the analysis so that if an ensemble plays the notes, you can possibly understand speech. So here's, I'm not going to go into that aspect, but this is a film made back in, I made it first in 1999, and then I improved it in 2001. I don't have the film with me here, but I'll just play a little example of sound. Woodwinds, strings. So that low melody, da 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 da, that's played by the strings, but you hear all these disturbances, and these come from here, or at least are shown here. So that's another example, and I think the final example of sound visualization. This is taken from this photograph was very, shall we say, dear to me, because I used to sit in the studio Stein in Amsterdam, and if you looked out of the window, you would see these buildings. And I was asked to make a CD cover for a recording of this piece. So I found this photograph on the internet. I contacted the photographer and asked him if I could use it. He said yes. And then I asked him for his postal address because I wanted to send him the CD, and he never responded. So I reminded him, I never got that. So I got his permission as an email, but I never managed to actually send him the CD. But this is what I did. I took his photograph, and analyzed it, or shall we say, separated it into the three colors, red, green, and blue. Does anyone know the Floyd-Steinberg approach, or Floyd-Steinberg algorithm for converting gray image, because red, green, blue is each actually gray, for converting that into black and white? It's a program which converts any gray image into dots. And the thicker, denser the dots are, the blacker it is, the more sparse they are. And you can see here, up here, the dots, you can almost see them individually, but here they're all combined. So what I did was, I had three pictures, one in red, one in green, one in blue. And then I converted them into dots, each one of them. Now this piece, I'll play the examples, and then I'll come back to explaining the graph. The piece itself is based on a melody, which starts off very consonant against a given drone. The drone sounds through the piece. This is a piece for piano. And you will hear this melody very, very consonantly. But as time goes on, and the piece is about 4 minutes long, I take out the individual notes one at a time, every now and then, and replace it with a less consonant note against the drone. So at the end of it, you hear a melody which is actually quite dissonant against the drone. But then you find out that if I move the drone to a new pitch, I'm back at the beginning, just transposed and phase shifted. So that note number 1 is now note number 7 maybe. Note number 2 is now note number 8. So the whole melody is shifted in time and shifted in pitch. We can hear the 4 examples. They're very short, so the whole piece. Consonant. So in this form, I've come back to the beginning. But for my actual image, I decided to take the red, as it were, actually now black on white dots, and shift it as horizontally and vertically. But I didn't do it like one on top of the other. I used a program to gradually fade from the one image into the other image. So you can actually see here how this image is getting paler and paler. These roofs are now almost gone, whereas the lower roofs, they start invisible and they gradually get more and more visible. So this is by writing a program to stochastically move from the first image to the shifted image, so that gradually you see the roofs disappearing, but you see them reappearing, shifted and shifted. Did that in red, did that in green, and did that in blue, mixed the three, and back to this image. The funny thing is, if you go very far from the image, you might be reminded of Monet. If you come a little bit closer, you might be reminded of Seurat. And if you zoom in very, very close so that all the pixels are squares, you might be reminded of Mondrian. So but this is not a work of art. It's simply an interesting phenomenon that I found was happening. So moving to a new topic, image sonification. Now, I lived in Cologne for a total of 32 years. And I also speak the dialect of the city. I mean, you know, I had to leave Cologne in 1973, long before I met Costa. And I had to leave for a year and a half. And I felt very nostalgic and disappointed that I had to go away. So I decided to write a piece based on Cologne in two ways. One was this piece of music called text music. Well, it was text music altogether, based on a text written by a Cologne, very nationalistic poet. And the text goes something like this. In Cologne on Rhine, I was born, and I'm very proud of the fact that I never forgot my mother tongue. And it goes on. Does anyone know German apart from Costa? You know German? I'll say the text in Cologne dialect. Just a little bit of it.
She knows also.
Yeah, but I don't have to translate.
Of course, Catherine would. En Gold am Ring ben ich geboren, ich han und dat lit me an Sinn, mein Muttersprach noch nicht verloren, dat is het wo ich stolz drauf bin. So this is the text that I chose in Cologne dialect. But at the same time, I had developed a technique called text music, in which you can write a piece for piano, and you don't have to be a musician to do that. You take the text, and you apply the letters of the text, one at a time, to the keys of the piano. So you could start on middle C, if you like, or on D, and then move, say, on the white keys in a zigzag fashion, left and right and left, or right and left and right and left, until all the keys of all the letters of the text are on the keyboard, but none is duplicated. So you'll have, if you have the English language, a total of 26, or if you like 52, if you want to take the small and the capitals differently. So you would have all on the white keys, then you'd have all on the black keys, and you'd have all on the mixed keys. You see, I'm not using any musical terms, but secretly we know this is diatonic, pentatonic, and chromatic. Words that will be in that dictionary of Greek-derived English words. So then you start to play the text, and you can play the text with individual letters, or you can play syllables, or words, or phrases, or sentences. And if what you play has more than one syllable, then you repeat it as many times, like here. N, Köln, with 4 letters, am Ring. I'm now playing a little phrase with the same thing played twice. And the principle is also that you can change the loudness between syllables. You can change the pedal depression between syllables, if you like. You can change the duration between short and long between syllables. And you can change the syntax. No, I'm sorry, the color of the keys. No, I believe, sorry, the syntax. Letters, syllables, words, phrase, or sentence can be changed only between words. But otherwise, every other parameter, the key color, the loudness, the duration, and the pedal use can be changed between syllables. So I made a number of versions of this piece, and all of these versions were, many of them that I did, were worked out with a computer program that I wrote in the language Fortran. Now, if you take this example, loudness, this means that at this point, about 33% of the notes are loud and 67% are soft. Again, you see no musical terms. Loud, soft, short, long, pedal, depressed, non-depressed, so on, black, white, mixed. So, as time goes on, suddenly there are a lot of loud notes. Over here it's about 85%. So, this program made use of an input in the form of a graph. And this graph would show you how the parameters would move. But for this particular version, I took the postcards of Cologne, and here you can see the Opera House, which is visible here. Unfortunately, I have the original postcards in storage in Cologne. So I wasn't able to, I made these graphs in Santa Barbara, California, from the internet. So they give you a similar vision, but someday I'm going to scan those. So here's the Opera House, over here for the first parameter. Here's this, where is it? Here. You can see Cologne Cathedral and the Hohenzollern Bridge. That's over here. Which is why, at the end of the piece, look down here, it's 100% black keys. And you can see here it's all pentatonic. And the same thing goes for the West Gate of Cologne, which is over here. And you can see the Rhine Panorama, St. Martin Major, and the Cologne Cathedral, over here. And finally, the Church of St. Gereon, which is here. So, all of these 5 picture postcards generated the piece, which I premiered. I used to be a pianist in those days. And then down here, the pentatonic bit. This was recently performed in Porto, in Portugal, by the way, just about, I think, 2 weeks ago. But I first premiered it in 1973. Now, this concept of text music I came up with in 1971. And I was very, very curious about how to compose a piece of music not based on any musical terminology, entirely based on everyday understanding. And when this was played in Darmstadt, version 1 in 1972, I composed it in 1971, it was a version lasting 20 minutes. This piece lasts 8, but that one lasted 20 minutes. And it was so unusual to the listeners' ears that there was a tremendous confusion after the performance. For 20 minutes, people, one half of the audience booed and the other half clapped. And the pianist had to walk to the front and take a bow 7 times. So it was quite a scandal. They said it was one of the 2 scandals of Darmstadt in 1972. The other one was a piece called Snowdrop by Christian Wolff. And there too, tremendous problem because we were moving away from Stockhausen with music like this. Now I may have to just give you a description of about 4 pieces, and because the films are not working in this PowerPoint. So then leave the PowerPoint and run them automatically, so in Windows Media Player or whatever. So this piece is based on the face of a pianist, Christie Becca. And since she and I used to love to go to Japanese restaurants, I took the Japanese pronunciation of her name, Kurisuti Becca. And this is written in katakana script, which I'm happy to say I can read. Kurisuti Beccaro. Actually, the Japanese would probably not use the ro. They would say Becca. But I prefer to do what they usually do when there is an R, which is necessary, to put the ro in at the end. And as you can see, this is a score for the right hand and the left hand. The right hand plays her first name, and the left hand plays her last name. So that's the prelude. But the chaconne is the more important thing, based on her face. Now, this is not the original pixelated graph that I took. I took a photograph of her face and reduced it to 88 by 88 pixels. So it's a pretty coarse quality, but I wanted that. 88 in time was, 88 horizontally was in time, and 88 vertically was pitch, keys of the piano. Now the piece that I showed you a little bit before, Until, with this one, was written for her, and it has 11 16th notes in every bar, 11 notes a second, and she plays it wonderfully. And there's a CD, the recording you just actually heard was her. 11 notes, 11, 11, 11. So what I've done here is, this is page number 1 with 88 16th notes, and these 88 correspond in the harmony to 8 bars of the piece Until. So harmonically it's related to that piece. And because Until changes in pitch, you will hear that at the end it also changes. It drops by a half step, semitone. So what I did was, I took the 88 by 88 pixels and worked out a system of radial lines emanating from her 2 temples. So one set of radial lines going out like this, one set of radial lines going from there, and whatever pixels were sitting on the radial lines, I would choose them and then do further constraints to reduce the number of notes. Secondly, they should conform to the harmony of the piece Until. Thirdly, they should fit into the 2 hands, and so on. So constraints like that. For page 2, I just rotate the radial lines by a small angle. I do the same thing. For page 3, the same thing. So each of these pages has a different selection of pixels because the radial lines are being changed, are being rotated, and then all the other constraints fitting into the harmony of Until, wherever it is. This is the end of Until. And then there was one more thing. These 3 words, very curiously, have a meaning in the language Bengali. Kuri means 20, Shruti means cotton threads, and Bekar means without work. So out of all the radial lines, I took out 20 and gave them no work. But then I also pronounced the text in Bengali Kuri Shuti Bekar, and imposed the phonetics of that as a spectral filter onto the notes. So here you can see no notes which would fit into the sound oo are on this page. There was no E. But here you can see some E because high formants from here to here. Ku, ri, and then a little silence. Shu, this would be here. Shu, ti, and then be, ka. And a is the first appearance of that vowel. So for the first time, you find the whole face being filled in. Because the formants of a, they overlap a little with oo, but they don't overlap with e. So the phonetic formants put on as a filter on top of the visualization, or the sonification actually, of the image. So if you look at this first bar, you can see it here, or here. Let's look at it here first. So these two notes are these two notes. And ta-dum, so going up here. So this is page 1. This is bar 1 out of 8 of page 1. So this will be 1/8 at the first page. And then you see page 2, page 3. Here's page 2 as well. So page 2, if you look at the shape of her mouth here, you can see that here as well. So I'll be showing you a 3-minute film after I finish talking. This is not going to work, and I don't want to try because it'll crash. So next piece. A piece written for Tom Johnson, the composer's birthday, when he turned 60. Do you all know Tom Johnson? Lives in Paris. Well, I'm an old friend of his, so I was asked. I didn't want to do the same thing, take Tom Johnson's face and make another piece again, because I'm somebody who very rarely uses a technique more than once. I might use it 2 or 3 times, but then not so often anyway. So while sitting in a tram from Amsterdam to The Hague on my way to work, I wrote down Tom Johnson's name from left to right and from bottom to top. So the later letters in the alphabet are at the top. One exception is HN, because the H is silent, vertical. And then I thought, okay, why don't I draw circles through 3 notes at a time? But there are several combinations. But I decided to take the TOM, the SOJ or JOS, for instance. Here you might see the MJH. So 6 circles, and one is the OOO, which is a straight line, which is a circle of infinite diameter. So I have 6 circles. And if you look at the score, you will see the OOO, and then again OOO, and then again OO, and then the next O is off the page. So the O is always middle C. And what I do is I scan the picture the way it is, and then I move all letters in an anti-clockwise way along the circle, very slightly. And then I scan it again. And then again, 91 times. And then I place all these scores one on top of the other. I call them micro scores, so that the O are always equidistant. So that's the way this works. And again, I have a little film to show you. Well, here are 2 situations. The JNS has now moved up to theta sigma psi. When I move beyond the Latin alphabet, I use the Greek at the top, and I use the Cyrillic at the bottom. So in this particular film, you'll also see this happen. And the piece is over when the SON come around completely one time. I don't see why I don't see the SON there again. There should be the SON. Maybe this is before the end, actually, not quite the end. 2 stages. At the very end, SON are back. And so that's why 91 times. So it's the rotating around the circle 1 full time, the smallest circle. So every time a line, a vertical line, which is going from left to right and scans the image, when it hits a letter, it plays that letter. The higher the letter, the higher the pitch. The lower, the lower. So that's how this piece is generated. The original version was for a group of Cologne called Ugly Culture. They were saxophone, guitar, electric guitar, saxophone, and double bass. And the week that I finished the piece and gave the leader of the group the score, he says, we broke up this week. So they never played it in that ensemble, but I have had it played for piano trio and other ensembles too, alto flute, for instance. So that's that, and this was going to be a movie, but I will show it to you later. Les ciseaux de Tom Johnson, by the way, means the scissors of Tom Johnson, but actually the 6 O's of Tom Johnson, the 6 circles, les ciseaux. And I could have said les trois O's, because his name contains 3 O's, but he was 60, 6-0. So it all comes together. Now, this is going to be the last example, and I was asked in 1995 to write a piece of music to be a soundtrack to an existing movie by Oskar Fischinger, which he made in 1930. Anyone not know Oskar Fischinger? Oskar Fischinger was a very radical experimentalist filmmaker of the 1930s, and then he decided to go to America for some reason. I don't know why people do that. And he landed in Hollywood, where he began to make commercial films for Walt Disney. So all this experimentation finished. But all this wonderful stuff was done in Berlin. He made only advertising films for Walt Disney. And the music of this film is horrible. It sounds like circus music. It's by maybe Mexican, maybe Spanish composer, Jacinto Guerrero. And it's circus music. So I was quite happy to replace the music by my own track. But unfortunately, the Fischinger Society in California and his daughter are totally, they disapprove of what I did. So I'm going to be talking in a symposium in November this year in California, in Santa Barbara, my own university. And I'm one of the co-producers. And I'm going to try and make a completely new film based on my own images, based on Fischinger's images. But it will not be Fischinger, so they cannot stop me. And I'm going to try and be very creative and do something very, very nice. I hope I'll manage with my own soundtrack. But otherwise, I'm not allowed to play this in concert because the Fischingers are against it. So I'll show you the image, but I'll show you my technique now. This film consists entirely of white little objects floating around, swimming around on a black screen. He did them, Fischinger, by drawing these images with charcoal on white paper, then using the negatives. So I decided that for I would do 2 things. I would take Nan Caro's Study Number 6. This film is called Study Number 6 by Fischinger. I would take Nan Caro's Study Number 6, which is for player piano, and for my program, Autobusk, if you ever want to find out about that, it's a program that can generate rhythms and melodies in real time. So Kostas knows it very well, and it's AUTOBUSK.
Me too.
You know too, exactly, that's right, exactly. So I used Autobusk to generate a new piece of music in the kind of a tango style, based on the harmonies and melodies, and not so much melodies, harmonies and rhythms and meters of Nan Caro. That's one layer, a tango-like music, using the harmonies and meters of Nan Caro. But the Fischinger objects, for each frame, I decided to generate one note stochastically. So let's take an example. This is a fictitious example. You see number 1 is a squat, round little thing. Number 2 is very broad. Let's just take those 2. So for object number 1, I take the formants of oo. My mouth is narrow, and I take oo, which is about 300 and 800 hertz, and draw curves of probabilistic distribution. Here they are. For 2, I will take E, because it's broad, and that could be, say, 300 and 3000 hertz. So that's there. And for everything in the middle, let's take, for instance, 4. It's somewhere in the middle. I take A. So by using 2 curves for the formants, the lower curve behaves like a parabola. It goes up from low to middle and then down to low. And the second formant goes from a little bit higher than that, like an exponential curve, like this. So that's formant number 2 and formant number 1 like this. And using a parabola and an exponential curve, I worked out for every ratio of length and breadth the formant positions. And for every frame, I have all of these. You may know this letter here, sigma. It shows you the sum of all the probabilities, and that probabilistic curve generates one note. And then for the next frame, one note. But you will see in the film that whenever the objects get broad, it'll become like E. It'll look like a mouth broadening, and it sounds like an E. And when it gets narrow, it'll also sound like an oo. And I also put a kind of filter on it, so if the objects go high into space, they have the same timbre, but they are filtered higher, and lower down a low-pass filter. So that's Estudio 7, the two pieces by Fischinger, Studio number 6, and Nancaro, Study number 6. I then used to form the title in Spanish, Estudio 7, which means study or studio number 7. Now, when I was a professor in The Hague, I ran an electronic studio called Studio number 7. And I did a lot of the work on this piece there. But most of it was done in the beautiful town of Cuenca in Spain. I was sitting on a beautiful terrace with a view of the mountains and the valleys, and that's why I gave it a Spanish title. So now let's go on to the movie sections. Starting with Kurisuti Becca, I will play that now. Her name in Japanese. So this is the actual superposition of the 10 pages. and not her original face. So it looks pretty much like a person's face. You can see it's going to repeat now, so I'll stop it. And any questions about that? Or maybe afterwards? Okay. So now I'm going to move on to Les Ciseaux, the Tom Johnson, and show you a fast version of the letters as they move. Oops. Yeah. Okay. Do it one more time. So now the actual piece, also about 3 minutes. The reason why I do this with MIDI is because it's accurate. If I were to ask Christie Becca to actually play it, it might produce a very ugly face. Because if she's slightly inaccurate, the whole face might get slightly. So I decided to put it in the MIDI. And here too, people have played this. This has been played by musicians, but it will never be as accurate as a computer. So we have to take the cheap sound of MIDI into account to see the result. So it's very geometric, which means that all the durations are very irrational. They're by no means in semiquavers or 16th notes or 8th notes. So I have written a program called Tupletizer that can take irrational values and write them in the form of tuplets, triplets, quadruplets, quintuplets, and so on. So I just determine what the most complicated tuplet is going to be in the score, and a score is then provided. As you can see, I'll do that again with the PPT. Oh, not the PPT, but anyway, I can take it. If you look at the score here, you see all these tuplets, triplets here, and I don't know whether I could simply... Sometimes it says from current slide, but this version doesn't. Yeah, so you can see septuplets here. It's probably the most complex tuplet in this particular score. But the incredible thing is, at one point where I started to beat in threes, it falls into a time grid, which is very amazing. And there's a bit later, but it suddenly becomes pure C major. But actually all these pitches are totally on a grid, a chromatic grid. So it was a strange coincidence that that should happen. I like that. So I've written in the score, sentire chiaramente il tactus, sentire chiaramente la tonalità. So that you really feel at that moment what's happening. And so now the last example will be Estudio Siete. And here we go, the Oscar Fischinger. Now, first I'll play you the Fischinger movie with the bad music. How do I go back? And so after the circus music, my own version. Thank you. So, any questions? I think we may have a few minutes. Yes.
You would say that there's a question of how accurate would you like your works to be performed by computers or by humans?
I prefer humans, but the computers give me an idea of what the piece could sound like. Unfortunately, sometimes, and most often even, my music's very difficult to perform. It's not my intention, but it turns out from the idea that I have to be very difficult, and one time a pianist practiced every day for 6 months on a 30-minute piece of mine, and he did a fantastic job. Sorry?
I can understand that.
Yeah. So, yeah, I definitely prefer human performers. But computers are very good for electroacoustic music, of course. And in these cases, as demonstrations, they're pretty good. For instance, if I were to play Nancarrow's original piece along with mine, I haven't tried that yet, but they would go very well together because they're exactly aimed at each other. And Christie Becca would love to play Until on another piano at the same time as City Becca, because they too go along perfectly. But of course, it's the MIDI version that could really prove it. The pianist's version would be very, very difficult to synchronize.
Even Common Carol's pieces were played only by piano.
Exactly, right, exactly.
Before the computer era.
Yeah, right. Exactly. He was one of the first, you might say, computer composers in a sense, because he wrote things for machines.
The fact is, how interesting are the works written by the composers?
Which composers?
By the composers in general. I mean, Egal, so it's irrelevant of playing the musician or the computer.
I don't know. Listen to Xenakis, for instance.
Yes.
He's a famous computer music composer.
Yes.
And his music's played on instruments.
Yes.
There's hardly any electronic stuff there. And it's great.
Yes. Well, I mean, his works are interesting.
Yeah. He's a much, I would compare Xenakis to maybe, if we go to the 19th century, I'm using an example now, say Brahms or Liszt's B minor sonata, let's say. I'm saying this because I would say Nancarrow is more like the Chopin preludes. They're very beautiful to listen to, but they don't have the depth that the Liszt B minor sonata has, for instance.
Okay, they are different languages, but anyway, okay.
Yeah, Xenakis and Nancarrow, different languages.
Yeah.
Exactly. Anyone else? Okay. Thank you.